I trust the movement, I negate the chaos, uplift the negative. I'll show up at the table again and again and again. I'll close my mouth and learn to listen. Whoa, whoa, oh, oh. 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 These times are poignant, the winds have shifted. It's all we can do to stay uplifted. Pipelines through backyards, wolves howling out front. Yeah, I got my crew, but truth is what I want. Realigned and on point, power to the peaceful, prayers to the waters, women at the center, all vessels open to give and receive. Let's see the system brought down to its knees. Whoa, whoa, oh, oh. Whoa, whoa, oh, oh. Whoa, whoa, oh, oh. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Whoa, whoa, oh, oh. Whoa, whoa, oh, oh. Whoa, whoa, oh, oh. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Ooh, ooh, ooh. I'm made of thunder, I'm made of lightning, I'm made of dirt, yeah, made of the fine things. My father taught me that I'm a speck of dust and this world was made for me. So let's go and try our luck, said I've got my roots down, 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 down deep. I've got my roots down, 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 down deep. I've got my roots down, down, down deep. I've got my roots down, down, down deep. So what are we doing here? What has been done? What are you gonna do about it when the world comes undone? My voice feels tiny, and I'm sure so does yours. Put us all together, make a mighty the movement, I negate the chaos, uplift the negative. I'll show up at the table again and again and again. I'll close my mouth and learn to listen.
Thanks for that great video, Brian. If you want to go ahead and get started.
Yes, welcome to today's Reclaiming Echo series. We are building a community. Please introduce yourself in the chat with your name, organization, tribal affiliation, job title, and everyone will be muted until the question and answer or feedback portion of our session today. And you'll receive a link to the recording and presentation by the end of the week. Continuing education credit. This activity is jointly provided by USET and Cardia Services. Cardia designates this live web-based training for a maximum of 1 credit for physicians, nursing, counseling, and social work. And you must complete this activity by attending the entire session. and completing the online evaluation that we will send to you via chat, and it'll also pop up in your browser once you close out of this window. And your certificate will be sent via email. And if you have any questions, you can contact me. And you'll see my email address at the end of the presentation, or Paige O'Sullivan at cardiaservices.org. And there are no relevant financial relationships to disclose. Bernice?
Hi, good morning, afternoon, wherever you're located. Welcome, all my relations. Mitakue Oyase. We are all related in the Sioux language. My name is Bernice UP Jordan. I am a citizen of the Fort Peck Sioux Nation. I am a public health program manager, tribal health support program support here at United South and Eastern Tribes. Next slide. You are on Indigenous land. To learn and acknowledge what tribal nation land you are on, you can go to this website here, or you can text this number and enter your zip code. Next slide. So we are reclaiming our community growth. We are connecting our Indigenous community. This data is from the 2023 registration. So each circle represents a collective number of people throughout the United States and some of the other countries as well. Thank you for being part of reclaiming our collective stories. Next slide. So I want to welcome Holly Echohawk. She will be presenting from now. If you would get on now, Holly.
Thank you, Bernice. Hi, everybody. Holly Echohawk here. I'm really happy to see you all today. Welcome to everyone, all the tribal nations that are joining, and a special welcome to any of our international guests. Thank you for joining us. We are happy to continue the Reclaiming Native Psychological Brilliance series. This is our second year. We started year 2 in January. And just super happy to have you all join. And I love the video at the beginning, resilience, and especially the dance. Amazing. So I want to welcome Dr. Anitra Warrior. Dr. Warrior and I are colleagues and friends, and I've always been incredibly impressed with her clinical training, always viewed through her tribal lens. She's done amazing work in Nebraska, and was very renowned work on a federal level as well through the SAMHSA grant programs. So I'm just thrilled that she's here with us today. You're in for a really wonderful treat. So I will turn it over to Dr. Warrior.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Holly. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. I have to admit, I was in shock when Holly asked me to present, and so I hope that I will do this presentation justice, and in honoring and recognizing all those who have presented before me, that we can keep that standard of excellence. So I will do my best today. In saying that, I also want to recognize just the title of this presentation series, and Reclaiming Native Psychological Brilliance, because there's so much power in reclaiming, and what that's talking about is reclaiming what's already ours. And it's important for us to recognize that, because, you know, as we learn about various theories in our fields, we know who created these, who did the publishing, who did the studying. But what's not given enough to us is the credit for where these studies had originated, or what's already been a part of our history, of our well-being, our survival. And so I think being able to be a part of presentations like this, whether as a presenter or as a participant, are all taking steps at reclaiming that and recognizing the brilliance within our people. So very happy to be here. One of the things that I would like to share, and I typically do this anytime I do a presentation, is I do go into a bit of self-disclosure. So again, my name is Anitra Warrior. I'm from the Ponca tribe of Oklahoma. I grew up in Oklahoma, and at a very young age, as a young mother, I had lost my oldest daughter in a natural disaster. So as you could imagine, it was very traumatic, and my healing process was really challenged with the experiences that I had in terms of moving to an urban setting and working with therapists to help me with that healing. And what ended up happening for me as a young adult experiencing significant grief and poor decision making, the work that I did with the therapists that I saw really became an unsafe place for me as a Ponca woman. And what I mean by that is anytime that I would share details, my lived experience and how I grieved or what my spiritual experiences were after my daughter's death, those things were pathologized. And from that, I recognize that, okay, if I'm going through this with these non-native clinicians, what are other people experiencing? And so from that pain became purpose. And I think that ties into what we're talking about today in terms of the post-traumatic growth and thinking about pain becoming purpose and it being a movement. And so from that experience, I had decided I'm going to be a psychologist. I'm going to work with people to train them to know how to provide services across cultures and also really specialize in serving our people. So I like to share that because I think it's important for people to know about where I'm coming from and how deeply I feel about psychology, about mental well-being, and my understanding of what our people have faced when it comes to services even currently. So again, it's an honor to be here, and I again hope that I can do some really good work today with you all. Next slide, please. So we have a few learning objectives that we'll go through today, and increasing knowledge of innate intelligence of Native people and relationship to healing capacity. I think that could probably be its own presentation where each of us from our tribal nations could share how we can tap into that intelligence for our healing. So we'll go through a few examples of that. We'll also learn about Native historical resilience and provide some examples of post-traumatic growth. We'll understand how Western colonization supports the narrow perspective of patient assessment. So we'll talk a little bit about the assessments and a different way to view those, and then increase knowledge of ways to modify behavioral assessment. And that's, again, going to tie into number 3, just in terms of how we view those, how we implement those. The other piece will be interpretation. And then gain practical resources for post-traumatic growth assessment. So we'll actually talk about one of the assessments that's available. Next slide, please. Thank you. So before we go into the various models that we'll be talking about today, I think it's important for us to talk about what trauma is. And so according to SAMHSA and the way that they describe trauma it's an event or circumstance resulting in physical harm, emotional harm, and or life-threatening harm. And it can have lasting effects on all of these different areas in our lives. So essentially, it's an event that overwhelms a person's capacity to cope. I think it's good for us to recognize the differences in how trauma can manifest, not just for adults, but for children as well. So when we think about our children that have had multiple placements, even when this is with relatives, there are new rules to learn, getting adjusted to the new sleeping arrangements. Those things, even if it's with family, close family, that can still be traumatic. Changing a school can be traumatic. So some of these things that we might think are a normal part of life, if it's going to a different school, can really be traumatic. So it's really important for us to recognize that trauma can also look very different based on the age that whoever is had that event. So again, just want to stress that to really keep in mind that the differences based on age and how our bodies can also remember trauma. So even if it's something that happened as a baby, our bodies can still have those responses. And so it's really important for us to keep that in mind. Next slide, please. There are 3 types of trauma that are described by the Crisis Prevention Institute. And so the acute trauma is going to be something that typically just happens one time. So like a car accident, a natural disaster. There's also chronic trauma, which could be violence, bullying, neglect. And then complex trauma is where we're going to see things where it's bringing multiple traumas together and we're having that experience. Now you'll see on the side that I highlight historical trauma as kind of overarching for each of these. And so I think anytime we're talking about marginalized populations, we need to recognize the impact of historical trauma and how that can be essentially woven into each of these areas, whether it be an acute trauma, chronic or complex. As Indigenous people, thinking about those things and the impact that that can have in the workplace, in the family, in the school systems, it's that pervasive and warrants that further exploration when we're talking about historical trauma and the impacts that has had on our communities. Next slide, please. So now that we've had that little bit of time to go over what trauma is and the different types of trauma, we can talk about post-traumatic growth. And what we're seeing here is that this is essentially when we have a negative experience, but it turns into something else. You know, as I mentioned, the pain becoming purpose. This is a part of post-traumatic growth. So it's also about the recognition of that strength. So I do have another slide here where we'll talk a little bit about the resilience, but what I think is really important for us to keep in mind is that there is a difference between growth versus resilience. And we'll go into a little bit more detail in that here in the next couple of slides. But with post-traumatic growth, you can expect there to be essentially almost a movement towards a new identity. That's what all of this is referencing, that growth that we experience. And it can happen even without a counselor. That's something that I think is also very important, because this comes down to our core beliefs and how we change as individuals, what we internalize and what we allow ourselves to accept and grow from. Next slide, please. With the post-traumatic growth studies, this was, and if you haven't read any of the work on this, I really recommend taking some time. There are tremendous amounts of articles that are out, whether it be about individuals. I know one of the studies that we have referenced here is about mothers who survived Hurricane Katrina, but there are also several studies and references to military as well, and how they've been able to grow from those traumatic experiences. But in about, I think it was around 1996 when Tedeschi and Calhoun started moving forward with this. And so it holds that people who endure psychological struggle following adversity can often see positive growth afterward. So important to recognize, because it takes time though. So it doesn't mean that it's going to be automatic. And this is the other piece that can really be helpful as we're talking and working with people, is understanding that this is going to happen on their schedule, not ours. And what I like about our tribal beliefs or our indigenous beliefs is the protocols that we have in place that can support that positive growth. So when I think about with my tribe, we have a year-long mourning process. And as we're going through some of the trauma that we experience, there are different times that we cry together. There are different times that we sing songs that allow us to just feel that emotion together, but it's done as a group, it's done together. And that doesn't mean that's the only way that you experience that emotion, but it's a time for everyone to come together, and there's protocols with that. And that provides additional support for us in our growth. So this is a way that we could experience post-traumatic growth through our tribal customs, through our tribal practices, without it being done with a therapist. And I'm a psychologist, so I'm huge on people going to therapy, but I also recognize the power of our culture and the protocols that are in place with our practices and with our beliefs. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a difference between post-traumatic growth and resilience. And what I like here is that resiliency is talking about the ability to bounce back. So what's different with post-traumatic growth is it can change relationships, it changes our core beliefs. And as I mentioned, it's almost like a new identity that can emerge. And that doesn't mean that we're moving completely away from who we were prior to that event, but it brings a different meaning to our life. And there are several areas of our life that we can recognize in a different way as a result of that. So resilience is yes, I went through this experience and I feel like I'm okay and I can move forward. I don't have to think about it anymore. I feel like I'm in a good place. So I could have a car accident and not have to apply any meaning to it. It was an accident. I've recovered. That could be a form of resilience. With post-traumatic growth, the difference would be applying meaning to that car accident. And maybe it becomes a personal movement for me in terms of what the safety looks like in cars. And then I make that into a movement for myself. It doesn't have to mean that I'm trying to change the world with that, but it's the meaning that's there for me and how I identify as a person. Next slide, please. So there is a post-traumatic growth scale that we're able to use. And it's called the Post-Traumatic Growth Inventory, also by Tedeschi. What I do want to say with that is that has been updated. We don't have the updated version here, but there has been more updates that have been put into this inventory. And so what this does is looks at the appreciation of life, the relationship with others, the new possibilities in life, personal strength, and spiritual change. And those are the 5 areas that we have that I was talking about when I said across our life we can have meaning in all of these different areas. And this appreciation of life can come with not just who we are as individuals, but within our families, within our communities. And the other piece, when we go into the next model with post-traumatic growth, is going to be looking at it more from that Indigenous perspective and how there's more of a collective approach that we can recognize when we're talking about post-traumatic growth, these inventories, how we're recognizing that for individuals, and how to use this in the clinical services that we provide. Next slide, please. So the other model that's separate from what Tedeschi has provided in terms of the post-traumatic growth inventory is the historical trauma and post-traumatic growth framework. And I really like this model because it seems to fit more for marginalized populations. So what we're talking about happening with this is that social transformation. Something else that was highlighted in the research that I've done with this is some of the remarks were that there is no post-trauma, there's no post-traumatic, because for many of our marginalized populations, we're still going through those traumas. So I think that is, for me, that was just so powerful to hear, because when we think about the services we're providing in our communities, not just in our reservations or rural areas, but also in our urban areas, there is still a great deal of trauma that we're experiencing. Even when we think about things like our missing, murdered, and Indigenous relatives, that's another key component to that, to where it's not post. These are things that are still happening. The same applies to the systemic violence and the discrimination that we experience, even for people who are going through school, when we talk about getting our educations, and recognizing these microaggressions that we experience when we're in school, receiving this training to go out and be these healers or support others, and then recognizing the mass group level growth and healing that can happen as a result of post-traumatic growth from this historical trauma perspective. This picture here is a group of middle school and elementary students, and they are actually in this camp that they went to. They're learning about psychology, they're learning about mental wellness. Along with that, they were also learning to present. Everyone had to work on a resume, and then get in front of the group and speak and share their resume. And it was so amazing, because some kids had highlighted their work as babysitters, as mowing the lawn, but it really gave them a good experience to get up and speak and present themselves. And the reason that I highlight this particular camp is because this is a change in education. When we think about what our tribal communities, what our tribal nations experience when we revisit the boarding school era, where are we? Where are so many of our people in terms of how education is viewed? This is something that we see in our communities, that it doesn't fit. Like right now, the most important thing is survival. And sometimes I need my kids to stay home to help watch my other kids. Or sometimes if I'm not feeling well, my kids are not going to be able to make it to school, or I have to work and they cannot get to school. And so it sometimes can be viewed as there's not that belief in education. The other part that is even more powerful that comes from that boarding school era is the lack of trust that we can have with our school systems. But what is happening here as post-traumatic growth is they're changing this for their students in this tribal community. They are starting to promote college at their elementary level. They're talking to their students about college. They're taking their students to college. So this is a way that they've been able to grow, even though they still have some of the boarding school structures there. They use those for college now. It's still used as classrooms with the other setting. And so it's a way that they've turned this, what had been a very horrific experience, into something that they're now empowering their children. Next slide, please. So these are going to be some of the areas of the historical trauma and post-traumatic growth framework. What you'll see is these are essentially the same from Tedeschi's model, but the difference here is that this is going to have that focus on the collective piece of it, which I think is so powerful and really defines who we are as Native people. So that's going to be that Indigenous perspective that we can apply to any of the models that we review in science, in behavioral health, all of those areas, not forgetting how we view that as a collectivist society. So that's why I really like this model and think it's important for us to recognize. So with collective strength, I just pulled out a few examples or highlights from each of these areas, but the social cohesion and mutual aid, this we can see across many of our tribal communities in rural, reservation, urban areas. When we have a traumatic event, how much volunteerism naturally happens that's not even seen as volunteer work. Our people do so much volunteer work when it comes to coming together for families in need, the cooking that we do, what's provided for our families. This is all part of that social cohesion and mutual aid. there's the collective spiritual change. So remember, I talked about how we have protocols. I just use my tribe as an example, but those protocols that are in place on when we have these ceremonies and what we experience and the support for those emotional experiences that we're having, that's a part of that collective spiritual change. And what we know and what we've seen is that we have so many people that have been removed from their culture, but find such healing and growth in this. When we think about how many of our people that were adopted out, but have now found meaning in their lives after returning to their people and understanding and learning more about their culture and pushing that and supporting that level of development for other people who have been adopted out, that's turning pain into purpose. And then new possibilities for our destiny. That's talking about decolonization. And, that's part of what was highlighted with the camp for the little ones in terms of, wait, we're going to take control of how we're promoting education, and we're going to make this work for us. And that's huge when it comes to our education, our land rights, water rights. All of these things come into play when we start talking about our destiny. And relating to our ancestors and culture. So one of the things, and I do have another slide here that will show this kind of like side by side, but what we know is that with the post-traumatic growth inventory and what Tedeschi had developed, it's going to have more of that individual focus. It's a very good model. So I'm not wanting it to sound like, it has to be one or the other, but I think this one highlights more of that Indigenous perspective, because we can also recognize how much we rely on our ancestors. One of the things we talk about a lot in our songs is how old some of our songs are. And when we think about doing our like the trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy, part of that process is the trauma narrative. One thing we're able to reference is how many of our songs are about battles. If you can go in and get those songs interpreted and recognize that they're sharing battles, experiences that our warriors had, that song is a trauma narrative. And that trauma narrative has been shared for generations. So that's one example. The other example is the prayer. Within my tribe, we have songs for our clans, we have songs for our children, we have songs for children who've been adopted, all of these different areas. And that's a way that we can connect. So when we hear those, we know that these were from our ancestors. They were singing for us all those generations back. This is how they're continuing to care for us. That's not typically what you're going to see when you're learning about Western models, but that's a way of decolonizing, but also connecting to our ancestors and our culture. The other one is the appreciation for our lives and the interconnectedness of the mass group, which I think all of these can highlight that. But when I'm going to speak on this in terms of my role as a behavioral health clinician or as a psychologist who works with other Indigenous psychologists, when we go into our communities and we're providing services, it's not just about this one individual that I'm working with. It's not about just my role within the school. What we're doing is for our people. And that's the difference. And that can change based on that level of post-traumatic growth that an individual experiences, again, from that historical trauma perspective, from that Indigenous perspective, that I think is so powerful and can be much more meaningful when we look at it from an individual view, but also from who we are as Indigenous people. Next slide, please. So this is where the table that I was mentioning in terms of being able to see the differences. So with the post-traumatic growth and the post-traumatic growth with the historical trauma perspective, you can see that there is a lot of individual in the PTG and the middle one. You can see that there's a lot of individual work that's going to happen And when they're side by side, that's when you can really recognize how big of a difference this is, and that this really is more of that collectivist view in terms of what we experience. So when we're talking about the unit of analysis, who is it that's actually going to be experiencing this growth? Who is it that actually experienced the trauma? That's where you're going to see that, yes, this can definitely happen individually, but there's also that opportunity and that recognition for community in terms of what we've all experienced. The trauma impact, when we think about that, it's from the post-traumatic growth model. It does have that individual lens in terms of what's happening across our lifespan. But as we talked about our generations in the previous slide, and even the work with our ancestors, that our healing is also impacted by our ancestors. I've listened to people from other tribes give very powerful presentations about the impact of historical trauma. And one of the things that stood out to me was that our healing is also healing for our ancestors. And that's going to be talking about that intergenerational, but it's not just going back to our ancestors, it's also for our future generations. And that's, again, going back to who we are, our Indigenous lens in terms of healing and well-being. The recovery approach can be very much based on psychological components, but when we look at it from that historical trauma perspective, we're going to be looking at all these areas: cultural, spiritual, of course, psychological, social, and historical. All of those things will come into play through this model. And then the intervention can look very different in terms of this being something that might be a community thing that we're experiencing. One of the communities that we served had a cluster of suicides, and it was very traumatic for the community. And even after we had experienced the high level of deaths by suicide, we saw a number of attempts afterwards that were very traumatic, that were happening in schools and public settings. And so, again, a very traumatic time. And that pain became purpose, but it happened at a societal level, and the tribal council became involved and made changes with their programming and what happened with their programming, not just during the day, but also in the evening. And it brought the community together in a way that felt natural. That wasn't about, okay, this model of intervention is going to be put into play. These are specific things we have to do. It was really about how the tribe healed in the past and pulling on their own knowledge based on their cultural experiences, their cultural beliefs. It was very powerful for them, and has had a long-lasting impact on their community. We're a few years out now from that time, and it's still something that is happening, that there's a lot of discussion about, and those changes have stayed in place and have been very powerful. Next slide, please. Was there a picture on here? Sorry, just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, I don't think so. So Native people have innate intelligence and a rich worldview that is often overlooked. This is going to be highlighted in a lot of the clinical work that we can do, how everything has to be evidence-based, right? That's like the gold standard, is it has to be evidence-based for everything. But they're not taking a look at what's practice-based, what we already know. I had the pleasure of listening to a presenter from California. And one of the things that he had shared was that, we can have these evidence-based models that have been studied for the past 50 to 80 years. But then you have this cultural knowledge that has been around for hundreds, thousands of years, but we're not viewing them the same. So to me, that was really powerful to hear that. Like, yeah, you're right. And a lot of these models have a Native influence on them as well. So also something for us to keep in mind. As behavioral health care providers, assuming that all Native patients have innate intelligence can change the trajectory of treatment. So powerful to recognize. And that ties back to the personal story that I shared in terms of my culture, my own knowledge on healing was pathologized. It wasn't turned into something that could have been embraced, that could have supported my healing. It was made to seem like I needed to be on more medication instead. And so the other piece to this that I would add is not just recognizing this in the patients, but when you have Native providers as well, recognizing their culture, their knowledge, and what that can bring into clinics overall. So I think it's kind of like that two-way street, and really recognizing the knowledge that's there. And tapping into the intelligence of Native patients can open the door to broader resources to help with healing and recovery. And that's really, again, going back to that collectivist approach, to where we have resources in our community. And it's up to us to open our minds, open our hearts to accept those resources, to really enhance services that are available to our communities. Next slide, please. So historical trauma is actually historical resilience. One of the statements that I love to hear is, because there's a big movement in terms of how trauma is passed down from generation to generation, the epigenetics and how it manifests in our system. And what we're not hearing enough about is, even though those things can be passed down, so can resilience, so can strength. And that's what we have to hold on to and recognize, is that with these medical models, these Western views, they've been so deficit oriented. And that's what they're looking for, is, so we can kind of cover up the symptoms or take care of the symptoms, but we're not actually looking at all of those strength-based approaches that we can capitalize on, that can continue to support our growth, not just at an individual level, but for that family, which in turn is for that community. So I think this is a really important statement in terms of recognizing that our historical trauma has also been our historical resilience, and that's something that we have to hold on to and promote. And I'm just going to leave this here for a second before I move on. I do want to pay attention to the time, because I get kind of windy sometimes. So I'm going to pay attention to the time. But what I want to share is a part of our brain that we have that is just amazing, and this is for our survival. It's called the reticular activating system. What the RAS is essentially a filter. So if you think about all the input that we can get daily, just from minute to minute, all the input, our brain is so amazing that it can filter out all the information that we don't need, but it's going to be providing what it thinks we want to see. So I'm intentionally leaving this slide here because I want our brains to get positioned to filter out all of that negative piece that comes to us. Like we hear these sayings like crabs in a bucket and things like that. But then when we hear those things, we're looking for those things. So a good example for the reticular activating system is if we get a new car, let's say we get a white van, we're going to be noticing all of those vans, right? We're going to see every single van that's driving by. That's an example of how the RAS is being activated and how it's kind of refining or making sure that you see what it thinks you want it to see. So think about this: historical resilience. Start looking for those pieces of historical resilience, of post-traumatic growth. Look for those in your communities and start bringing those to light, sharing those with other people, because the more you talk about it, the more you see it, the more your brain is going to be conditioned to filter those things out. It's not saying that we overlook the negative, because we still have to address those things, but this is also a way for us to really move towards that strength-based approach, which has often been overlooked for our population. Next slide, please. So when we talk about Native historical resilience, there are several movements across tribes, collectively as tribal nations have come together, the tribal legal battles for water rights. So this is the Yurok tribe here that there is this beautiful picture of them. I'm going to pay attention to time, so I'm not going to go into a lot of details on this, but they're addressing the ancestral rights that they have for fishing and hunting. And I've seen this across multiple tribes in terms of how they're using that to their advantage, even for food sovereignty, and paying close attention to that, to where these lands are not open to public. And sometimes they do allow them to be open to public for a very high fee. And again, that goes back into supporting what they're doing. So that level of sovereignty being something that they're able to do, that's a part of historical resilience, and embracing that and making these things work for us, but recognizing, again, our knowledge in terms of how we care for the land and how we're making that work for our people and our survival. Next slide, please. So this is Bears Ears National Monument in Utah. And this was another beautiful experience, not a personal experience of mine, but something that I've read about with tribes coming together. And this is, again, about the conservatorship of the land and how they're taking care of it, the water, everything. And this was a sacred place for tribes. Could we go ahead and go to the next slide, please? There's going to be just a little bit more information. Yeah, so there's this intertribal coalition, which is about 5 tribes that have a movement. They do have a website that is just phenomenal in terms of what they're able to provide, the movement that they have. It's received presidential support. And that's kind of wavered depending on who's in office, but that presidential support has been there. There's a lot of communication, but it's really about their own way of life that I think is so powerful. And this is a form of post-traumatic growth when we're talking about that destiny and how we're changing the trajectory of our lives for our communities, for our people. So I encourage you to look into this and visit the coalition's website. They have a ton of information on there. That's a great example of post-traumatic growth. Next slide, please. So now we're going to move into screening and assessment. And what I think is really important for us to recognize with this is that depending on what type of screener you have. So a screener is going to be something that's very brief, typically, whereas an assessment is going to be something that's going to be in more detail and can take a lot more time for us to conduct or gather the appropriate information. So we use screeners and assessment to sometimes develop a diagnosis. This will inform our treatment plans. And so pretty powerful in the work that we're doing as clinicians. We have to remember that these are snapshots of experiences. One of the very common screeners that is used is called the Patient Health Questionnaire 9. So that just means that it has 9 items. So the PHQ-9 that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. So this is looking at symptoms of depression over the past 2 weeks. It's going to change based on what a person is experiencing, what stressors are like at work, what's happening with their children, what's happening in the community, any national movements. Those can all have an impact in the way that screener is responded to. And so it's important for us to remember that this is a snapshot. This is something that we have to continue to do, not just a one and done. We have to make sure we're gathering more information on this. They're also self-report. So sometimes we can have experiences with people who don't have a great deal of insight, or sometimes that insight might be blocked by things that they're experiencing or the high level of trauma. So their self-reports may not be completely accurate, that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them. It's again about what they're experiencing at that time. And then also recognizing how these are time oriented. So when we're having to remember things from the past, depending on what that experience is, those views of that time can vary drastically. So for Native people, the indigenous worldview perspective, history of colonization, and the erroneous assumption of superiority of Western thought in the field of psychology can create harm. I think that goes back again to the story that I had shared about my own experience and how my beliefs were pathologized. And that's something that we can see is how culture can be pathologized. There's a lack of understanding in terms of how this impacts daily life. So when we see things that are going to be just about, well, what is their level of enculturation? So it's like we're trying to put a measure on that, a measure on how Native we are, a measure on how Ponca you are. That it really isn't going to apply. So that lack of understanding is important for our clinicians to be aware of, anyone who's providing support in our communities, and then the interpretation of the results. It's good to get consultation. We have within our clinic, it's very common for us to do consults on what the results of the assessments and the screeners are, to say, this is going to be common. This is something that we would expect to see in this community, and not making broad general statements, but that's why it's done in consultation to see, like, okay, is this something that we need to look further into, or is this a normal experience for this culture? So those are a few things for us to keep in mind when we're talking about screening and assessment. Next slide, please. Okay, with strength-based assessments, I know we have just a few minutes left. What's important for us to keep in mind are there's going to be these three things. So moving beyond the traumatic experiences. This is not what defines us. That is not all. That is not the end all be all. That's not all we will ever be. It's important for us to remember that. Assess for cultural strengths and resources. So we can sometimes be blindsided by, not blindsided, but blinded to all the resources, the strength, the knowledge that's there within the community, because of the way that our training has colonized us to think about only those evidence-based practices that are right in front of us that we can go to a textbook and see. So it's important for us to think about, okay, what are the cultural strengths here? How do we incorporate those into healing? And what are going to be the other resources throughout the community that are available? And then assess for that interest in cultural knowledge and enculturation. We do want to understand where they are. We don't want to force culture on anyone, but we do want to know if this is a strength that they have, then let's capitalize on that. Let's allow or support the whole person being in that room for that healing, not just the parts that fit within our Western model of therapy. We want the entire person to be there. Next slide, please. Okay, with that, there is a cultural connectedness scale. So it's developed to measure the extent to which First Nation youth are integrated with their Native culture. It includes strength-based queries that some tribal communities have used as ideas on how to add or expand cultural assessment queries to standard assessments. So again, we don't want to separate this from the individual, but this is a way that we can get to understand where they are in terms of their cultural integration, what they believe, what they practice, what they know, how much we want to make this a part of session. Because again, it's not something that we're going to guide, but it's something that we can support and invite into that healing area. So that, I believe, is my last slide. We can, yes, thank you very much.
Oh, Dr. Warrior, you are fabulous. And, let me just say one thing, two things, actually. Our whole series is about reframing, reclaiming, reframing. And you did such a beautiful job of reframing. And 2 points. One is historical trauma is actually historical resilience. And the second thing that you said that I loved is the phrase turning pain into purpose. So thank you for that fabulous presentation. And I think we have Olivia next to make a couple of comments, and then we close with some poetry spoken word today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Warrior. That was amazing. And what I do just for a few minutes here is invite folks to share some reflections, and I may unmute you if there's a couple of reflections you want to share. I do know that I paid attention to the call to action that I heard from you, really around, looking for examples of resilience in the, and uplifting that. We do have one question that came in, and this was around how to find Native therapists, and if you have anything that you might be able to talk to around that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think networking is going to be the biggest thing that we can do. So we are a Native owned clinical practice here, and I think we have almost every Native therapist in Nebraska working with us, but it's been about networking. And so that's getting relationships established with universities that will have a higher Native population. There's also the Society of Indian Psychologists, which I highly recommend looking up. They have a mentorship program for new therapists, but they also have therapists and psychologists that provide a number of trainings that support workforce development. So again, the Society of Indian Psychologists, I think, would be a great resource to look into for recruitment.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was one other reflection just to share, and that was, let me just find it again. The whole idea about, really looking at the community, that, the love, basically the comment was, I love that the community knowledge was brought up, is something I personally struggle with a lot, that there's so much emphasis on Western studies and not historical community knowledge, when so much research is actually based on community knowledge. And I wonder if, is there anything more that resources you can point people to find out more about kind of community knowledge research?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's good to, one, go out and get to know the community. One of the things that we promote within our clinics is when we go to a reservation, if we have a new clinician, they're going to spend time with our elders. They're going to get to know the community in that way and learn and get to have that experience with them and what they're willing to share. The other piece is just establishing those relationships with other organizations. So what this means for us is how we view our work differently in terms of, I'm not going to just sit in my office. I'm going to go out and be integrated into the community and be a part of the community. And that really helps with relationships. That can also help reduce stigma when it comes to our views or our community's views on behavioral health. So going outside of the office and establishing those relationships can be huge when we're talking about those partnerships and community knowledge that's available.
Thank you so much. One last one, it's just a comment that I know that we push evidence-based practice, but what is ignored in healthcare is, as you mentioned, is praxis-based evidence. And just the innate knowledge is what we seek from qualitative research, where we want to better understand the person's worldview. So it's just a reflection on everything you've said. So I just wanted to share that before turning it back over to you, Holly. And thank you so much, Dr. Warrior.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I put in the chat just a reminder that everyone who registers, even if you're not able to attend, if you know someone who registered but couldn't attend, everyone receives the PowerPoint and the link to the recording by the end of this week. And thank you for USET, because that's the responsibility of USET, and they do a fabulous job in that follow-up. So I think we're just going to close out now with this wonderful spoken word. And Brian, I don't know if you want to say anything more or just start it. So, and then we'll close out after this is over. So everyone have a wonderful day. I'm glad that you joined us.
My name is Sarah Lewis, and this poem is called Warrior Cry. I am the warrior cry that penetrates, swings, slings through your House of Commons window, Not uncommon in my bloodline, though. I'm the high priestess, the empress, grabbing glass ceilings on my way down, turned into a floor, turned to powwow grounds. I dance and stomp on top of shreds of the 1763 Royal Proclamation buried beneath my feet. Jingle dresses and fancy shawls sweep the red-crusted floor. I crow, hop, stop, and point to every door, evicted of opportunity, every timeline, every generation eradicated. Here is where I stop and pray. I see my own fractured lineage covered up with a Band-Aid branded reconciliation. My moccasins reveal the mess you made crammed onto reservations. Crucifixes and crying eyes disguised as a friendly Thanksgiving dinner get-together. A dinner reservation we did not make, had no choice in the matter of, painted as a special seat by the door and told to leave before the main course. Leftovers presented on a gold-plated platter and advertised as the special. Starved of culture, freedom, love, our children, how special. But my ancestors, unshackle us daily, have prayed for us for millennia. I am your Notre Dame turned to flames, the fire starter that won't get out of the house that shamed her, a ceremonial smoke medicine flavor, healing yet spicy. A lyrical physicist, transcending truths through time and spaces that I now take up. A felony if you dare touch me, burned hands will remind you that my blood still boils, and land acknowledgements aren't going to fix that. Because acknowledgements without change is like sorry without action. Assaulting the land is an attack on Indigenous women's bodies and communities. This is forced entry to our life givers. Indigenous women nurture our future, feed our babies with ceremony. Babies that grow because of places like Pigeon Lake, the same place where cottagers protest our wild rice monomen for being too thick along the shores for their water skis to get through, of course. The irony of their anger, having something taken away, as though their water sports trump our livelihood. You scream bloody murder and I scream privilege. Tired of being labeled radical because I want clean drinking water for our communities, for Indigenous women and men to be alive, to thrive, yet we're devalued by the blue lives that promise us safety. Tired of being punished because of pigment. But I digress. Indigenous women, the backbone of the body we've abused, holding us together in this rusted, gated, concrete-fused skeleton. They always call me back to my home, my purpose, my power, my displaced body. I forever owe debt to my aunties, grandmothers, sisters, friends, so this one's for you, Miigwech. It's been an honor just to see how far I've come in the last 3 years. I would not have imagined myself here as in Peterborough as first poet laureate and getting to tell my story and use my voice. And I think that's what spoken word is about. It's a form of activism for me, and it's a form of resistance. My existence is a form of activism because we weren't supposed to be here. So I know my ancestors would be proud, and I know my grandmother would also be very proud that I'm speaking up and speaking my truth.
Thank you all for attending today. Don't forget to complete your survey. It is posted on the screen and it's also in the chat. If you have any questions, please contact either Bernice Jordan or myself. And see you in May at the same time, 4th Tuesday. Thank you.
So here's our new closing tagline, Bernice, to everybody. When we say goodbye, we have to start saying, have a brilliant day.
Have a brilliant day.
Have a brilliant day.
Bye, guys.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Did you stop the recording?
Thank you.